At the edge of a quiet suburb just outside Chicago, there was a small shooting range tucked away behind rows of trees. It wasn't fancy, just a dusty field with metal targets and wooden benches, but it served its purpose well for those who came seeking solitude or practice. Among the regulars at this unassuming place was a man named Marcus Johnson. He wasn't loud or flashy. In fact, he blended into the background so seamlessly that most people barely noticed him, unless they were paying close attention. Marcus was tall, lean, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His dark skin bore faint lines from years spent under the sun, and his hands, calloused but steady, moved with practiced precision whenever he handled firearms. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, Marcus would arrive early, park his old pickup truck near the entrance, and walk to his usual spot without saying much to anyone. He didn't come to socialize or show off his skills. Instead, he seemed to use the range as a kind of sanctuary, a place where he could focus entirely on the task at hand. The other shooters had their own theories about Marcus. Some whispered that he must have been in law enforcement because of how disciplined he was. Others guessed he might be ex-military, pointing to the way he carried himself and the effortless efficiency with which he loaded magazines, adjusted sights, and fired rounds downrange. But no one really knew for sure. Marcus never volunteered information about himself, and when someone tried to strike up a conversation, he'd usually respond politely, but briefly, before returning to his work. One particular Saturday stood out among the rest. The weather was crisp, with a light breeze rustling through the nearby trees. As always, Marcus arrived early, setting up his equipment with deliberate care. He wore a plain gray hoodie pulled over a black t-shirt, along with faded jeans and sturdy boots caked with dirt from previous visits. Around his neck hung a pair of protective earmuffs, and on his hip rested a holster holding a sleek, well-maintained pistol. Everything about him suggested preparation and routine. While Marcus prepared for his session, another figure entered the scene, a young man in his early 20s named Jake Reynolds. Unlike Marcus, Jake radiated energy and enthusiasm. He moved quickly, bouncing between lanes as he unpacked his gear, occasionally glancing around to see if anyone was watching. Jake was a Navy SEAL recruit on leave from training, eager to test his skills against civilians and seasoned shooters alike. With his sharp jawline, buzz cut, and athletic build, he looked every bit the part of someone destined for greatness. Jake had heard rumors about the quiet guy at the range, the one everyone respected but few actually knew anything about. Today, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to pay closer attention to Marcus. From a distance, Jake observed as Marcus began firing. Each shot rang out with perfect timing, striking the center of the target with unnerving accuracy. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation, just smooth, calculated actions that spoke volumes about years of experience. As Jake watched, something caught his eye, a tattoo peeking out from beneath the sleeve of Marcus's hoodie. It was subtle, almost hidden, but unmistakable once you noticed it. Two crossed rifles formed the centerpiece, framed by an eagle spreading its wings above them. Below the design, a date was etched in bold lettering, 03/22/93. Jake frowned slightly, tilting his head as he studied the image. It wasn't like any standard military insignia he'd seen before. There was something personal about it, something significant. Intrigued, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the tattoo held a story worth uncovering. As Marcus reloaded his weapon, Jake hesitated for a moment, debating whether to approach him. On one hand, Marcus didn't seem like the type to appreciate interruptions. On the other hand, Jake's natural curiosity, and perhaps a hint of admiration, drove him forward. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed a box of ammunition and walked over to the lane next to Marcus. "Hey," Jake said casually, trying to sound friendly without being intrusive. When Marcus glanced in his direction, Jake gave a quick nod toward the target. "Nice shooting, you make it look easy." Marcus paused, lowering his firearm slightly. For a brief moment, his expression softened and he offered a faint smile. "Thanks," he replied, his voice low and measured. Then, without another word, He turned back to his task, resuming his methodical pace. Jake felt a pang of frustration. Clearly, Marcus wasn't interested in making small talk. But Jake wasn't ready to give up just yet. After all, SEAL training had taught him persistence. Leaning against the divider between their lanes, he decided to take a more direct approach. So, what's the deal with the tattoo? He asked, nodding toward Marcus's arm. Looks pretty unique. This time, Marcus didn't immediately respond. Instead, he finished firing off a few more rounds before finally lowering his weapon again. He stared at Jake for a long moment, as if weighing whether to answer or brush him off entirely. Finally, he sighed softly and glanced down at the tattoo. It's a reminder, he said simply. Some things you don't forget. Jake leaned forward, his interest piqued. Of what, if you don't mind me asking? Marcus hesitated, then shrugged. A day that changed everything. Before Jake could press further, Marcus stepped away, heading toward the bench to clean his gun. It was clear that the conversation, or whatever it could be called, was over. Despite the abrupt dismissal, Jake found himself more intrigued than ever. Who was this quiet man with such incredible skill? What did the tattoo mean, and why did it seem to carry so much weight? As Marcus continued working, his movements calm and unhurried, Jake realized that unraveling the mystery wouldn't be easy. But one thing was certain. Marcus Johnson wasn't just another face at the shooting range, and Jake was determined to find out why. The following Saturday, Jake returned to the shooting range with a mix of determination and curiosity bubbling inside him. He had spent the entire week replaying his brief interaction with Marcus in his mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, and especially that cryptic response about the tattoo being a reminder. It gnawed at him. Not in an obsessive way, but in a way that made him genuinely want to understand who Marcus was beneath his quiet exterior. This time, Jake arrived even earlier than usual, hoping to catch Marcus before he settled into his routine. Sure enough, as Jake pulled into the gravel parking lot, he spotted Marcus's familiar pickup truck already parked near the entrance. The older man was standing by the back of his vehicle, carefully unloading his gear, a rifle case, a duffel bag, and a small cooler. Jake grabbed his own equipment from his car and approached cautiously, not wanting to startle or irritate Marcus. Hey, Jake said, his tone casual but respectful. Mind if I set up next to you again? Marcus glanced up briefly, then nodded, without saying a word. His expression remained neutral, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Jake took that as permission and began setting up his lane, keeping one eye on Marcus as he worked. There was something mesmerizing about the way Marcus moved. Efficient, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Every item had its place, every action served a purpose. Even the way he arranged his magazines on the bench seemed calculated, as though years of experience had taught him exactly how to maximize efficiency. As they both geared up, Jake tried to think of a way to ease into conversation without coming across as pushy. He decided to start with something simple, something that might feel less intrusive. You come here every weekend? He asked, keeping his voice light. Marcus paused, adjusting the scope on his rifle. Most weekends, he replied after a moment. His tone was clipped but not unfriendly. Jake nodded, pretending to focus on assembling his own firearm while sneaking glances at Marcus. Must be nice having a place like this to clear your head. Marcus shrugged slightly, still focused on his task. It's quieter than most places, helps me focus. Jake hesitated, wondering if he should press further. But then he remembered the tattoo, the crossed rifles, the eagle, the date, and decided to take a risk. I've been thinking about what you said last week, he ventured. About the tattoo. You mentioned it reminded you of a day that changed everything. Care to elaborate? For a split second, Marcus froze. His hands hovered over his rifle and his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Then slowly he exhaled and turned to face Jake. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep weariness that suggested he'd heard this question or variations of it many times before. It's personal, Marcus said finally, his voice low and steady. Not something I talk about often. Jake held up his hands apologetically. No pressure, man, I just... I don't know. Something about it stuck with me. Feels important. Marcus studied Jake for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether the younger man's interest was genuine or merely idle curiosity. Finally, he sighed and leaned back against the bench, crossing his arms over his chest. Let's just say it marks a chapter of my life I can't forget. Doesn't matter how much time passes, it stays with me. Jake tilted his head, intrigued. A chapter? Like, military stuff? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a water bottle from his cooler and took a slow sip, buying himself some time. When he spoke again, his words were measured, almost guarded. Yeah, military. Long time ago. Jake's pulse quickened. This was more than he'd hoped for. A tiny crack in the armor, a glimpse into Marcus's past. What branch? He pressed gently, trying to sound casual, despite his growing excitement. Army, Marcus replied after a pause. Special operations. Jake felt a jolt of recognition. Special operations. That explained so much. The precision, the discipline, the aura of quiet authority that surrounded Marcus. But it also raised even more questions. What had he done? Where had he served? And why did he carry himself with such weight, as though burdened by memories too heavy to share? Before Jake could ask anything else, Marcus stood up abruptly and picked up his rifle. Enough talk, he said firmly. Let's shoot. Jake recognized the dismissal for what it was and didn't argue. Instead, he followed Marcus's lead, loading his weapon and taking his position at the lane. As they fired side by side, the rhythmic crack of bullets hitting metal filled the air, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. Despite Marcus's reluctance to open up, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of progress. For the first time, Marcus had acknowledged his military background. A small victory, perhaps, but one that fueled Jake's determination to learn more. Over the next hour, Jake made a conscious effort to mirror Marcus's technique, observing the subtle nuances of his stance, grip, and breathing. Occasionally, Marcus would offer a brief tip or correction, his critiques sharp but constructive. Relax your shoulders, he advised at one point. You're tensing up too much. Let the gun do the work. Another time, he pointed out how Jake's finger placement on the trigger could affect accuracy. Smooth pull, not a jerk. Think of it like a handshake, not too firm, not too loose. Jake absorbed every word, grateful for the guidance. But beyond the technical advice, he noticed something else. Marcus wasn't entirely closed off. While he clearly valued his privacy, there were moments when his guard slipped ever so slightly, revealing glimpses of a man who cared deeply about passing on knowledge. It was as if teaching others, even in small ways, was part of how he coped with whatever haunted him. When their session ended, Jake lingered by the bench as Marcus packed up his gear. Summoning his courage, he decided to make one final attempt to connect. Listen, he began. I know I probably come off as nosy, and if I'm stepping over any lines, just tell me to back off. But I respect what you've been through, even if I don't fully understand it yet. If you ever feel like talking, I'm here. Marcus stopped what he was doing and looked at Jake for a long moment. There was no irritation in his gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement of the sincerity behind Jake's words. After a beat, he gave a slight nod. Appreciate that, he said simply. It wasn't much, but to Jake it felt like a breakthrough. As Marcus walked away, his figure blending into the morning mist, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something profound. Whatever secrets Marcus carried, they weren't going to reveal themselves easily. But Jake was willing to wait, to listen, and to earn the trust of the quiet man whose story seemed written in ink and silence. The days following their conversation at the shooting range left Jake with a restless energy. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus, his quiet strength, his guarded demeanor, and that mysterious tattoo that seemed to hold the key to understanding who he truly was. Jake's curiosity wasn't just idle fascination. It felt like a calling, as though uncovering Marcus's story might somehow help him make sense of his own journey toward becoming a Navy SEAL. Determined to learn more, Jake began piecing together fragments of information from anyone who might have crossed paths with Marcus before. On his next visit to the range, he struck up conversations with other regulars, subtly steering the topic toward the older man. At first, most people shrugged off his questions, saying they didn't know much beyond the fact that Marcus was an exceptional shooter. But eventually one veteran, a grizzled man named Tom with a salt and pepper beard, offered a clue. "Yeah, I've seen him around for years," Tom said, leaning against the bench as he reloaded his pistol. "He doesn't talk much, but when he does, you listen. Heard through the grapevine he was part of some elite unit back in the day, something big, classified." Jake's ears perked up. "Classified? Like special forces?" Tom nodded slowly, scratching his chin. "Could be. All I know is there are whispers about Somalia. 1993, if memory serves. Somalia." The word hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He'd studied military history extensively during his SEAL training, and the mention of Somalia immediately brought one event to mind: the Battle of Mogadishu. Known infamously as Black Hawk Down, it was one of the deadliest engagements in modern U.S. military history. A brutal firefight that had claimed the lives of 18 American soldiers and left countless others wounded. If Marcus had been involved in that operation, it would explain so much about him. The weight in his eyes, the precision in his movements, the way he carried himself as though burdened by memories too heavy to share. Armed with this new piece of information, Jake returned to the shooting range the following weekend, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived, Marcus was already there, methodically setting up his gear as usual. For a moment, Jake hesitated, unsure whether to confront him directly or let the topic simmer until the right moment presented itself. In the end, his impatience got the better of him. Standing beside Marcus, Jake took a deep breath and blurted out, "Black Hawk Down, right? That's what your tattoo's about." Marcus froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over a magazine clip. The air between them grew thick with tension, and for a moment Jake wondered if he'd gone too far. Then slowly, Marcus straightened up and turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. "How do you know about that?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice tinged with caution. I asked around," Jake admitted, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. "And then I did some digging. Somalia, 1993. It all adds up." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then without another word, he turned back to his equipment and resumed preparing for his session. Jake opened his mouth to apologize, but Marcus cut him off. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Despite the rebuff, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something. Over the next few weeks, he continued showing up at the range, determined to chip away at Marcus's defenses. Each time he approached the older man with care, asking thoughtful questions and sharing bits of his own experiences as a SEAL recruit. Slowly but surely, Marcus began to open up, not in grand revelations, but in small, incremental ways. One rainy Saturday, as they stood side by side under the shelter of the range's roof, Marcus finally broke his silence. "You really want to know why I don't talk about it?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the patter of raindrops. Jake nodded earnestly. "I do. Not because I'm nosy, but because I think you've got something to teach me. Something important." Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. For the first time, Jake noticed how tired he looked, not physically but emotionally, as though carrying a weight that never lifted. "It's not heroics you're looking for," Marcus said finally. "What happened that day, it wasn't glory. It was chaos, loss, pain. We went in thinking we were saving lives, and instead..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head slightly. "Let's just say not everyone came home." Jake swallowed hard, realizing just how raw the wounds still were, even after decades. "Were you part of Task Force Ranger?" he asked softly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his rifle and adjusted the scope, his hands moving with practiced precision. When he spoke again, his words were measured, almost detached. "Yeah, part of the ground team. We were sent in to secure a crash site after. One of the Blackhawks went down. Things went sideways fast. Jake listened intently, hanging on every word. He wanted to press further, to ask about the details, the sounds, the sights, the emotions. But he could see that Marcus was treading carefully, revealing only what he could bear to share. It's funny, Marcus continued after a pause. People hear Black Hawk Down and they think of movies, books, medals. They don't realize what it really means. The faces you can't forget. The voices you still hear in your dreams. Some nights I wake up thinking I'm back there surrounded by gunfire and smoke, and then I remember, it's over. But the scars, they stay. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always imagined war as a series of heroic moments, acts of bravery captured in headlines and history books. But hearing Marcus speak, he realized how wrong he'd been. War wasn't just battles won or lost. It was the lives shattered along the way, the sacrifices made by those who never asked for recognition. As the rain eased and the clouds began to part, Marcus turned to Jake with a look of quiet resolve. You want to honor the men I served with? Don't romanticize what we did. Remember them, not as heroes but as human beings, brothers, sons, friends. That's all they ever wanted. Jake nodded solemnly, feeling a profound shift in his perspective. He understood now that Marcus's reluctance to talk wasn't about secrecy or pride. It was about respect. Respecting the fallen meant carrying their memory forward, not as symbols of valor but as reminders of the cost of conflict. From that day on, Jake approached Marcus differently. He stopped probing for details and instead focused on learning from the older man's example, his discipline, his humility, his unwavering sense of duty. And while Marcus still kept much of his past locked away, Jake knew that he had earned a rare privilege, the chance to glimpse the soul of a man shaped by both extraordinary courage and unimaginable loss. Weeks turned into months, and Jake's visits to the shooting range became less about uncovering Marcus's secrets and more about building a genuine connection. The two men had fallen into an unspoken rhythm. They'd arrive early, set up their gear, exchange a few words, and spend hours firing side by side. Jake no longer pushed for answers about Somalia or the tattoo. Instead, he focused on learning from Marcus, not just about marksmanship, but about patience, focus, and the quiet strength it took to carry burdens without complaint. But while Jake had accepted that some stories were too painful to tell, his curiosity about Marcus's past hadn't entirely faded. One evening after returning home from the range, he found himself unable to shake the feeling that there was still more to discover. Sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee in hand, Jake opened his laptop and typed a single phrase into the search bar: Medal of Honor recipients, Battle of Mogadishu. The results appeared almost instantly, filling the screen with names, dates, and grainy photographs. Jake scrolled through page after page, scanning headlines and snippets of text until one particular article caught his eye. It was titled, Local Soldier Awarded Medal of Honor for Valor in Somalia. Beneath the headline was a black and white photo of a younger Marcus Johnson standing beside President Bill Clinton, his face solemn as he received the nation's highest military honor. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the link and, as he read through the article, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. According to the report, Marcus had been part of Task Force Ranger during the Battle of Mogadishu. When one of the Black Hawk helicopters crashed, he volunteered to hold off enemy forces while medics worked to save injured comrades trapped inside the wreckage. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Marcus fought relentlessly, exposing himself to heavy fire multiple times to ensure his team could retreat safely. His actions saved countless lives, but not without cost. Several of his closest friends died in the chaos, and Marcus himself sustained injuries that ended his combat career. As Jake finished reading, he sat back in his chair, stunned. The man he had come to admire for his quiet humility was, in fact, a living legend. A true hero whose bravery had earned him the highest recognition possible. Yet Marcus carried none of the arrogance or pride that might accompany such an accolade. If anything, he seemed burdened by it, as though the weight of the medal only reminded him of those who hadn't made it home. The next Saturday, Jake arrived at the range with the article saved on his phone. He wasn't sure how, or even if he should bring it up, but he knew he couldn't let the discovery go unacknowledged. When Marcus showed up, calm and composed as always, Jake greeted him with a nod and began setting up his lane. For a while, they shot in silence, the rhythmic crack of gunfire blending with the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Finally, summoning his courage, Jake approached Marcus during a break. "Hey," he said, holding out his phone so Marcus could see the screen. I did some research." Marcus glanced down at the article, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered the phone and looked at Jake, his dark eyes piercing. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with something, resignation perhaps, or disappointment. "It was online," Jake admitted, suddenly feeling like a child caught doing something wrong. "I didn't mean to pry. I wanted to understand." Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, staring off into the distance. Then, shaking his head slightly, he said, "You're persistent, I'll give you that." "I'm sorry," Jake said quickly. "If I crossed a line I didn't mean to, I needed to know." Marcus studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to trust him with the truth. Finally he nodded toward the bench, inviting Jake to sit. As they settled down, Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What do you want to hear?" he asked quietly. "The official version, or the real story?" "The real one," Jake replied without hesitation. "Whatever you're willing to share." Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "The official version makes me sound like some kind of superhero," he began. "Like I ran in guns blazing, saved the day, and walked away unscathed. But that's not what happened. Not even close." He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "When the helicopter went down, we all knew it was bad. Really bad. Enemy forces swarmed the crash site within minutes, and we were outnumbered 10-1. My job was supposed to be simple: provide cover fire so the medics could extract the wounded. But nothing about that day was simple." His voice grew softer, almost distant, as though he were reliving the moment. "I remember hearing the screams, the pilots, the crew chiefs, the soldiers on the ground. Some of them were friends, brothers, guys I'd trained with, laughed with, trusted with my life. And then, in an instant, they were gone. Just gone." Jake listened intently, his chest tightening with each word. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort or reassurance, but he knew better than to interrupt. "By the time reinforcements arrived, I was barely standing," Marcus continued. "Shrapnel wounds, bullet grazes, exhaustion. The docs patched me up, told me I'd done enough. But enough doesn't erase the faces you see every time you close your eyes. Doesn't bring back the ones you couldn't save." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant echoes of gunfire from other lanes, and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. "About the Medal of Honor?" Marcus shrugged, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Because it doesn't change anything. Those medals, they're not for us. They're for the families, the politicians, the history books. Me? I don't need a piece of metal to remind me of what happened. I live with it every damn day." Jake nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. To Marcus, the award wasn't a badge of honor. It was a reminder of loss, of the friends he'd left behind. And yet, despite carrying that weight, he had chosen to keep moving forward, finding solace in quiet moments at the shooting range and passing on his knowledge to those willing to listen. "You're stronger than most people realize," Jake said finally, his voice filled with admiration, "not just because of what you did back then, but because of how you've handled everything since." Marcus chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Strength isn't about medals or glory, kid. It's about getting up when you want to stay down. About honoring the dead by living for the living. That's all I've ever tried to do." As they sat there together, the bond between them deepened. Jake realized that Marcus wasn't just teaching him how to shoot. He was showing him what it meant to lead, to persevere, and to carry the weight of responsibility with grace. And though Marcus would likely never fully open up about his past, Jake understood now that some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud. They lived in the way Marcus carried himself, in the steadiness of his hands, the wisdom in his eyes, and the quiet dignity with which he faced the world. From that day on, Jake approached their time together with renewed purpose. He stopped seeing Marcus as a mystery to solve and started viewing him as a mentor, a guide who had walked paths Jake could scarcely imagine. And though the older man remained guarded about certain aspects of his life, Jake knew he had earned something far more valuable than answers: the respect and trust of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow emerged with his soul intact. As the weeks turned into months, Jake found himself growing not just as a shooter, but as a person under Marcus's quiet guidance. What had started as casual curiosity had evolved into something deeper, a mentorship built on mutual respect and shared values. Jake no longer saw Marcus simply as the quiet guy at the range. He now understood him as a man shaped by extraordinary experiences, someone who carried both immense pride and profound sorrow in equal measure. Their conversations became more frequent, though Marcus still revealed only fragments of his past when he felt comfortable. These moments were rare but impactful, like pebbles dropped into a still pond, each one sending ripples through Jake's understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and resilience. One rainy Saturday, as they stood side by side under the shelter of the range's roof, Marcus surprised Jake by opening up in a way he never had before. "You remind me of myself," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the silence between shots. His voice was low, almost contemplative, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to Jake. Jake lowered his rifle and turned to look at him, startled. "Me? How?" Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not physically, obviously, but there's a hunger in you, a drive to prove yourself. I recognize it because I used to have it too. Back then, I thought being strong meant never showing weakness, never backing down, never letting anyone see the cracks." Jake frowned slightly, intrigued. "And now? Now I know better," Marcus replied. He paused, adjusting his grip on his weapon before continuing. "Strength isn't about pretending you're invincible. It's about knowing your limits and pushing past them anyway, about carrying the weight of what you've been through without letting it crush you. That's what makes a leader. Not medals or titles, but the ability to keep going when everyone else wants to quit." Jake absorbed these words carefully, feeling their weight settle over him. In many ways, Marcus's advice mirrored the lessons he'd learned during SEAL training, but hearing them from someone who had lived through war added a new layer of meaning. For the first time, Jake realized that becoming a SEAL wasn't just about physical toughness or technical skill. It was about developing the mental fortitude to face challenges head-on, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Over time, Marcus began sharing practical tips beyond marksmanship. He taught Jake how to read body language, anticipate threats, and make split-second decisions under pressure. "It's not always about pulling the trigger," Marcus explained one afternoon. "Sometimes it's about knowing when not to pull it. Discipline is just as important as firepower." These lessons weren't delivered in long lectures, but rather in brief, pointed exchanges that stuck with Jake long after they left the range. Once, while discussing situational awareness, Marcus stopped mid-sentence and pointed to a distant tree line. "See that shadow moving near the edge?" he asked. When Jake squinted and shook his head, Marcus smiled faintly. "Exactly. You miss things when you're too focused on what's right in front of you. Always scan the periphery. Always expect the unexpected." Though Marcus rarely spoke explicitly about Somalia, his experiences clearly informed everything he taught. Jake could sense the echoes of battle in Marcus's every move, the way he positioned himself for maximum visibility, the deliberate calm in his voice, the instinctive readiness to adapt. It was as if Marcus's entire life had been shaped by the lessons he'd learned during those harrowing days in Mogadishu. One crisp autumn morning, Jake arrived at the range to find Marcus unusually restless. The older man paced back and forth along the lane, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. When Jake greeted him, Marcus nodded absently but didn't respond right away. Something was clearly weighing on his mind. "Everything okay?" Jake asked cautiously after setting up his gear. Marcus hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Today's October 3rd, he said quietly. "Anniversary of the crash." Jake froze, realizing why Marcus seemed so distracted. Until now, he hadn't fully grasped the emotional toll these anniversaries must take. "Do you want to talk about it?" he ventured gently. To his surprise, Marcus nodded. "I think I do," he admitted. "But not here. Let's go for a walk." They left the range behind and wandered along a narrow dirt path that wound through the surrounding woods. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. As they walked, Marcus spoke haltingly at first, then, with increasing intensity. "The crash site was chaos," he began, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "Smoke everywhere. Gunfire coming from all directions. My team, we did our best to hold the perimeter, but we were outnumbered. Every second felt like an eternity. And the noise." He trailed off, closing his eyes briefly as if trying to block out the memories. "The noise never stops. Even now, sometimes I swear I can hear it." Jake listened silently, giving Marcus the space to share as much or as little as he needed. When Marcus paused, Jake asked softly, "What kept you going? How did you keep fighting when everything around you was falling apart?" Marcus considered the question for a moment. "The faces," he said finally. "The guys next to me. I couldn't let them down, not while they were still breathing. And afterward," his voice cracked slightly and he cleared his throat. "Afterward, I kept going because quitting would have made their deaths meaningless. They gave everything so the rest of us could live. The least I could do was honor that." By the time they returned to the range, Jake felt as though he'd glimpsed a part of Marcus's soul that few people ever saw. The older man's vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was strength. It took courage to confront the past, to acknowledge the pain without letting it define you. And in that moment, Jake resolved to carry that lesson forward into his own life. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened further. Jake began seeking Marcus's advice not just on tactical skills but on personal matters as well. When he struggled with doubts about his future in the SEALs, Marcus listened patiently and offered perspective. "Doubt is natural," he said. "Even the best soldiers feel it. The key is not to let it paralyze you. Focus on what you can control and trust that you'll figure out the rest as you go." By the time Jake completed his SEAL training, he knew he wouldn't be where he was without Marcus's guidance. On graduation day, standing among his fellow recruits, Jake felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the instructors who had pushed him to his limits, but for the quiet man who had taught him the true meaning of strength and sacrifice. Months later, Jake returned to the shooting range, this time wearing the uniform of a Navy SEAL. As he approached Marcus, who was setting up his lane as usual, Jake extended a hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then clasped his hand firmly. "You earned it," he replied. "Now go show the world what you're made of." And as they stood side by side once again, firing rounds downrange, Jake realized that Marcus's legacy wasn't written in ink or etched in metals. It was alive in the stories he told, the lessons he passed on, and the lives he touched. Silent, yet enduring. Years had passed since Jake Reynolds first met Marcus Johnson at the shooting range, but the bond they shared remained as strong as ever. What had started as a chance encounter between two strangers had grown into a deep and meaningful mentorship. One that shaped not only Jake's career as a Navy SEAL, but also his understanding of what it meant to be a leader, a soldier, and a human being. By now, Jake was no longer the eager, wide-eyed recruit who had once peppered Marcus with questions about his past. He had earned his trident, the emblem symbolizing his status as a SEAL, and completed multiple deployments overseas. Each mission tested him in ways he couldn't have imagined during training, but through it all he carried Marcus's lessons with him: the importance of discipline, humility, and resilience, the value of focusing on what truly mattered rather than chasing glory or recognition. On a crisp autumn morning several years after their initial meeting, Jake returned to the same shooting range where it had all begun. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Alongside him stood 3 other young SEAL recruits, men he had been tasked with mentoring as part of their final preparation before deployment. They were raw, full of energy and determination, much like Jake had been when he first arrived at the range all those years ago. As they unpacked their gear and set up their lanes, Jake scanned the area for Marcus, spotting him near the far end of the range. The older man hadn't changed much. He still moved with the same quiet efficiency, his presence commanding respect without demanding attention. His hair was streaked with more gray now, and the lines on his face had deepened, but his eyes retained the same steady intensity that had always drawn Jake in. "Hey," Jake called out as he approached Marcus, his voice warm with familiarity. "Mind if we join you?" Marcus glanced up, taking in the sight of Jake and his team. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like you've been busy," he said, nodding toward the recruits. Jake chuckled. "You could say that. These guys are almost ready for the real deal, but I figured there's no better teacher than the one who taught me." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Flattery won't get you extra tips." "It's not flattery," Jake replied earnestly. "It's the truth. You showed me what real strength looks like, not just in combat but in life. And I want them to learn from the best." For a moment, Marcus simply studied Jake, his expression unreadable. Then with a small nod, he gestured toward the benches. "All right, let's see what they've got." Over the next few hours, Marcus worked with Jake and his recruits, offering guidance that went far beyond technical marksmanship. He emphasized situational awareness, teaching the younger men how to anticipate threats and adapt quickly to changing circumstances. He drilled them on teamwork, reminding them that success in battle depended not on individual skill but on trust and communication within the unit. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus instilled in them the same values he had passed on to Jake: humility, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others. "Being a SEAL isn't about being a hero," he told them during a break. "It's about doing your job, not for recognition but because it needs to be done. Remember that and you'll never lose sight of why you're here." The recruits listened intently, hanging on every word. To them, Marcus wasn't just another instructor. He was a living legend, someone whose actions spoke louder than any title or accolade. And though they didn't know the full story of his past, they could sense the weight of his experiences in the way he carried himself, in the quiet authority of his voice and the precision of his movements. As the sun began to dip below the tall horizon, casting long shadows across the range, Jake pulled Marcus aside while the recruits packed up their gear. "I owe you everything," Jake said softly, his tone filled with gratitude. "Not just for teaching me how to shoot, but for showing me how to lead, how to live." Marcus shook his head slightly, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You don't owe me anything, kid. You did the hard work. All I did was point you in the right direction." "That's not true," Jake insisted. "You gave me something I didn't even realize I needed, a purpose, a reason to keep going, even when things got tough. And now I'm trying to pass that on to them." Marcus looked over at the recruits, watching as they laughed and joked with each other, their camaraderie evident despite their nerves. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as though reflecting on the countless lives he had touched over the years. Not just Jake's, but countless others who had crossed his path. "You're doing good work," Marcus said finally, turning back to Jake. "Keep it up. The world needs people like you. People who remember what really matters." Jake nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to say more, to express just how much Marcus had impacted his life, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he extended his hand, clasping Marcus's firmly. "Thank you," he said simply. For everything. Marcus returned the handshake, his grip strong and steady. Take care of yourself, Jake, and take care of them. With that, Marcus turned and walked back toward his truck, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. As Jake watched him go, he realized that Marcus's legacy wasn't confined to medals or memorials. It lived on in the stories he told, the lessons he shared, and the lives he inspired. Silent yet enduring, it was a testament to the power of humility, sacrifice, and quiet strength. Later that evening, as Jake drove home with his recruits, one of them spoke up from the back seat. "Sir, who is that guy? The one who helped us today?" Jake smiled, glancing in the rearview mirror. "That," he said, "was a man who taught me what it means to be a SEAL. Not just in skill, but in spirit. Someday, maybe you'll understand," and as the car sped down the highway, Jake knew that Marcus's influence would continue to ripple outward, shaping the next generation of leaders just as it had shaped him. In a world often driven by noise and chaos, Marcus Johnson remained a quiet beacon of wisdom and courage, a reminder that true heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about carrying the weight of the past with grace and passing its lessons on to those who will follow.